The first spring's full light. The long ordeal of winter was finally behind them. The village, worn but steadfast, stood quietly beneath the rising sun of the early spring. The frost that had defined months of struggle had melted, leaving the earth soft and damp, revealing paths and fields previously hidden beneath white blankets. The air was warmer now, though still carrying remnants of the winter chill, and every sound, the gentle gurgle of streams, birds calling from distant trees, the rustle of animals moving through thawed grass, felt amplified, significant, and comforting. For peasants, this season's arrival was not marked by celebration in the sense of feasts or song. It was, instead, a time of observation, reflection, and cautious action. They moved slowly but deliberately, attuned to the lessons winter had taught them. Every step outside was measured. Mud, lingering ice, and unstable ground reminded them that survival required attention, patience, and care. Children ran freely where snow had vanished, exploring cautiously under the watchful eyes of parents. Their energy was contagious, a subtle signal of life continuing, yet the adults remained grounded, aware that the peace of spring was fragile and dependent on continued diligence. Households began a rhythm that blended relief with preparation. Bedding was washed and aired, stored for warmth in future seasons. Heavy wool clothing was repaired or repurposed. Firewood, though less essential, was replenished for potential cold nights. Meals were more generous as food stores were replenished with early spring foraging and the first tentative crops of the season. Adults ate cautiously, yet there was a sense of abundance compared to the strict rationing of winter. Animals, too, reflected the seasonal shift. Herds moved to new grazing areas as snow receded, and livestock shelters were cleaned and repaired. The care of animals had been a constant necessity throughout winter, and it now transitioned into a management of growth and productivity rather than mere survival. Every decision, feeding, herding, cleaning, was informed by the months of experience in observing behavior under extreme conditions. The nights, though shorter and less severe, remained periods of reflection. Sleep deepened gradually, yet vigilance persisted as a habit ingrained through winter. Fires were tended calmly, bedding adjusted with practiced hands, and the household rested with an understanding that life's fragility demanded consistent care. Awareness of the environment, of neighboring households, and of subtle changes in weather persisted, forming a quiet confidence. Children learned from this season as much as adults. They absorbed lessons of patience, observation, and subtle resilience. They saw how adults handled tasks methodically, how small errors could have consequences, and how cooperation ensured survival. Their play was cautious, sometimes interrupted by chores, yet the memory of winter's lessons lingered in their behavior. The next generation, though now free to move and explore, carried forward the knowledge of endurance. The social bonds within the village strengthened further. Neighbors exchanged advice, shared tools, and collaborated on preparing the land for planting. Support, previously quiet and cautious during winter, became practical and more confident. Families worked in tandem, guided by the implicit understanding that their collective survival had depended on careful attention, shared labor, and quiet cooperation. The village's resilience was no longer a theoretical concept, it was a lived reality, manifest in the synchronized efforts of its inhabitants. Mentally and emotionally, peasants experienced a quiet but profound transformation. The fear, anxiety, and exhaustion that had dominated months of winter began to recede. They reflected on losses, livestock, health, even some human life, but balanced these with the undeniable proof of survival. Their households remained intact, their children alive, their labor rewarded with the return of light and warmth. Relief was measured, internalized, and practical. It was a calm understanding that the world, though harsh, could be endured and navigated through diligence, cooperation, and resilience. The earth itself seemed to encourage reflection. Melting snow revealed fertile soil, suggesting the potential of growth and abundance. Streams, once muffled by ice, sang softly, a subtle reminder that time had passed and that the cycles of nature continued reliably. Birds returned with tentative songs, and small animals ventured out of hiding. Every element of the environment communicated continuity and renewal, reinforcing the lessons that winter had imparted. Patience, observation, and adaptation were essential for life. Spring became a teacher as well as a reward. It illustrated the results of careful endurance. Fields could be tilled, crops planted, and livestock nurtured. The household could expand its efforts from mere survival to the measured pursuit of growth and improvement. Every routine, habit, and learned skill acquired during winter now had application beyond protection. They were tools for cultivating life itself. As days lengthened and warmth increased, the village settled into a gentle rhythm. Labor was balanced with rest, observation with activity, and vigilance with measured relaxation. The long months of winter had left their imprint on every household, habits refined, knowledge deepened, bodies conditioned, and minds disciplined. Survival had not been passive, it had been deliberate, sustained, and attentive. And these attributes now carried forward into a season of opportunity. By the end of this early spring, the villagers recognized something profound. The trials of winter had not merely tested their endurance, they had shaped the way they lived, worked, and interacted. The silent victories of long nights and harsh conditions translated into confidence, skill, and wisdom. Households were stronger, communities more cohesive, and individuals more attuned to the rhythms of life and nature. The first full light of spring symbolized both a literal and metaphorical awakening. The darkness of winter, once oppressive and inescapable, had yielded to warmth, activity, and growth. Life, fragile and demanding in winter, now demonstrated its persistence and potential. Peasants could observe their accomplishments quietly, understanding that survival itself was not only a necessity but an achievement. In conclusion, the village had endured the coldest nights and most challenging months, emerging with lessons engraved into daily life. Vigilance, care, patience, cooperation, and observation had ensured survival. The slow passage of winter had been grueling, yet it had cultivated skills and wisdom far beyond mere endurance. The world, harsh as it had been, revealed the potential for growth, renewal, and hope. Winter's trials were now memories, instructive and solemn, but spring's arrival offered a gentle promise: life could continue, strengthened by past experience, and the household could move forward with confidence, skill, and cautious optimism. The first spring, full of light, was more than a season, it was a testament to resilience, the quiet triumph of survival, and the enduring rhythm of human life. The first dawn of spring. Finally, the long winter receded, and with it, the relentless nights that had tested every aspect of peasant life. The first true signs of spring were subtle at first: a faint warmth in the air, sunlight lingering slightly longer above rooftops, streams murmuring as ice cracked and flowed. Yet for medieval peasants, these changes carried profound significance. They were not merely seasonal shifts, they were proof that endurance, patience, and careful living had been rewarded. The nights, once oppressive and infinite, now seemed shorter, almost bearable. The frost lingered in corners and along shaded paths, but its sting was tempered by the promise of renewal. The long months of vigilance, rationed meals, and constant attention to fire, bedding, and animals had forged patterns of behavior that now guided the household smoothly. Each family member moved with practiced efficiency, their bodies accustomed to measured effort and their minds trained to respond to subtle signs of change. Morning light arrived with a different quality than in the depths of winter. It was softer, less harsh, carrying warmth in small, almost imperceptible measures. Children stirred with more energy, stretching limbs stiffened by months of confinement. Adults, though still weary, observed the environment with cautious optimism, noting the thinning snow, the glint of water running freely, and the first tentative movements of returning wildlife. The household began tentative expansions of activity. Windows were opened slightly to allow fresh air, bedding was rearranged to reduce layers, and clothing was adjusted in response to the milder temperature. Every act was deliberate, guided by months of survival experience. Even small miscalculations could disrupt comfort, but the principles learned during long nights, attention to detail, patience, and adaptation, ensured that the household adjusted successfully. Food remained carefully measured, but optimism altered perception. Root vegetables, stored grains, and preserved meats were still rationed, but the knowledge that spring would bring fresh harvests made scarcity less daunting. Adults continued to prioritize children and the elderly, maintaining household cohesion. Yet now there was a sense that life could expand beyond mere survival, that meals might soon offer more than sustenance alone. The night still arrived, but its character had transformed. Darkness was no longer an oppressive force, It was a temporal pause, a period of reflection and routine rather than terror. Fires still glowed, embers were attended, and blankets were adjusted, but the urgency of deep winter had faded. Sleep returned to a more normal rhythm. Adults rested more fully, and children's slumber deepened without constant parental monitoring. Vigilance, though present, was measured and calm. Storytelling and ritual continued, but their purpose shifted. Tales no longer emphasized endurance against immediate danger. Instead, they explored the promise of life returning to fields, the behavior of animals emerging from hibernation, and the plans for planting and cultivation. Whispers of gratitude replaced the fearful prayers of winter nights, and small rituals focused on blessing future labor rather than protection from the cold. Socially, the village began reconnecting more actively. Neighbors ventured out to assist one another with tasks previously impossible during the harshest months. Firewood was shared more freely, advice exchanged about repairing damage caused by frost or storms, and the collective memory of survival guided cooperative efforts. The invisible network of winter endurance shifted from silent vigilance to quiet encouragement, reinforcing bonds that had been tested and strengthened by months of hardship. Bodies, though still lean and stiff, began responding to increased activity and light. Muscles recovered slightly as movement became less about survival and more about preparation for work outside. Circulation improved with exposure to sunlight and increased motion. Even minor tasks, walking to a neighbor's home, carrying water, adjusting fencing, felt significant after months of constrained movement. Mentally, peasants experienced profound relief. Anxiety, fatigue, and the constant pressure of vigilance eased gradually. Reflection replaced dread. Adults considered losses endured, livestock, neighbors, family members, but also victories, households kept alive, children fed, fires maintained, structures held against storms. These internal acknowledgments created a quiet pride, an understanding that the hardships of winter had produced not despair, but competence, resilience, and wisdom. Even the environment seemed to encourage recovery. The earth began to soften, revealing frozen soil beneath melting snow. Streams, once silent under ice, whispered again. Birds returned, their calls faint but clear. These subtle signs reminded peasants that survival was now not only possible but likely. Nature itself, slowly resuming its cycle, provided confirmation that their endurance had been meaningful. By the first true dawn of spring, the village appeared almost renewed. Homes that had been dark and silent during the longest nights were now touched with light. Animals stirred with increased energy. Children explored cautiously, while adults prepared for the practical tasks of planting, repairs, and continued household management. Survival had been proven. Life could now expand beyond mere maintenance into growth, creation, and the quiet joys of human existence. The first spring days were not a celebration marked by noise or ceremony. Instead, they were observed with practical recognition, a return to routines that allowed expansion, an acknowledgement of lessons learned, and a reinforcement of the rhythms cultivated during winter nights. Families carried forward the skills, patience, and vigilance acquired over months of adversity, ensuring that the knowledge of endurance persisted into future seasons. Winter, in its severity, had left an indelible imprint. Its nights had been long, dark, and challenging, testing body, mind, and spirit. But survival, achieved through careful attention, cooperation, ritual, and quiet perseverance, had produced profound resilience. Peasants emerged not triumphant in the way of heroes, but capable, disciplined, and deeply aware of the fragility and strength of life. In conclusion, the first dawn of spring symbolized both an ending and a beginning. It ended the months of relentless cold and oppressive nights, but it also began the next cycle of labor, growth, and preparation. The lessons of winter, attention, patience, cooperation, and endurance, would carry forward, shaping the daily lives, relationships, and decisions of villagers for years to come. Survival had been earned silently, and its imprint would last far longer than the frost that finally melted from the fields. The long nights were over. The cold, though lingering in pockets of frost, no longer commanded fear. The village exhaled collectively in quiet relief. Life persisted, strengthened by the trials endured. And in the reflective calm of early spring, peasants understood something fundamental: survival itself, maintained with vigilance and care, was the truest measure of resilience. Emerging from darkness. With the first hints of spring, medieval peasants experienced a transition unlike any other. The nights remained long, but their weight was less oppressive. The relentless cold began to loosen its grip, though frost still lingered in low-lying fields and on shaded roofs. The long months of hardship, vigilance, and quiet endurance had not erased fatigue or hunger, but they had forged a rhythm in the household, a practiced resilience that made life manageable even in lingering winter. The emergence from darkness was subtle. Days lengthened incrementally, sunlight touching the edges of village roofs before it had in months. Snow, though still present, began to melt slowly in sheltered spots. Streams murmured faintly as ice loosened from their banks. Even small signs, the movement of returning birds, the smell of thawing soil, were noted with careful attention by those who had spent months tracking every sign of survival. Households adapted cautiously. No one assumed that winter had fully released its hold. Fires were maintained with the same vigilance as before, though slightly less urgently. Blankets continued to be adjusted, and clothing layers were still necessary. Even minor exposure could chill the body rapidly after months of deep cold. Experience taught peasants that overconfidence could be deadly. Children noticed the change more instinctively than adults. Their bodies responded to the faint warmth and additional light, waking more easily, moving more actively, and occasionally exploring outside under careful supervision. Parents allowed small steps of freedom, watching carefully, aware that months of indoor confinement had made even minor excursions challenging. Food remained scarce, though the first signs of spring promised relief in the weeks to come. Stored grains, roots, and preserved vegetables were rationed with continued care. Adults often reduced their own portions to favor children and the elderly, maintaining the household's overall survival rather than individual comfort. Even small acts of shared sustenance became symbolic of enduring hardship together. The night remained a time of vigilance, but its character changed. While fear and exhaustion still lingered, hope now threaded through the darkness. Rituals continued, but with a slight alteration. Prayers included thanks for surviving the worst, as well as requests for the coming warmth and bounty. Stories told at night shifted to reflect emerging life, the return of animals, and fields readying for planting. These narratives reinforced the belief that the long months of suffering were purposeful, preparing peasants for the next cycle of growth and labor. Socially, villagers began tentative reconnection. Snow-cleared paths allowed neighbors to visit once more, offering shared wood, advice, or assistance with small household tasks. The invisible network of communal endurance, formed over months of isolation and vigilance, became active again. This cooperation, practiced quietly for survival, now carried hints of encouragement and reassurance. Bodies, though worn, began to adapt to the increasing daylight and slightly warmer temperatures. Muscles, stiff from prolonged cold, slowly regained flexibility. Circulation improved in response to movement and sunlight. Even small physical shifts, opening a window for the first time in months, walking outside without layering excessively, felt profound after the restrictive months of winter. Mentally, peasants experienced subtle relief. The constant pressure of vigilance loosened slightly. Nights were still observed, but the oppressive weight of winter had begun to lift. Anxiety decreased, replaced by measured optimism. Lessons from the previous months were not forgotten, rather, they became part of the household's collective wisdom, guiding actions with an informed caution rather than fear. Emerging from darkness also brought reflection. Adults considered who and what had survived. Losses were mourned quietly, and the achievements of survival were recognized internally. The endurance of children, the care of animals, the maintenance of homes and fires, all were remembered as proof of capability and resilience. Even the smallest victories carried profound meaning after months of near-invisible struggle. Nights still demanded attention, yet their nature had shifted. Frosted windows, the soft crack of embers, and distant howls were no longer overwhelming threats but elements to observe calmly. Vigilance became measured, less urgent, allowing the mind and body to recover gradually from months of high-intensity endurance. By the final nights before spring fully arrived, households experienced a delicate balance between caution and hope. Survival had been maintained, but the promise of life returning to the land gave meaning beyond mere existence. Every routine action, every careful observation, every small act of care reinforced the knowledge that life continued and that the hardships of winter had not been endured in vain. The emergence from darkness was also symbolic. Winter had been a teacher, forging patience, resilience, and cooperation. Villagers had learned the limits of human endurance and the value of quiet observation. They had discovered that survival depended not on strength alone, but on care, precision, and the shared commitment of family and community. As the nights grew shorter and the horizon lightened, peasants sensed that the season of sleep, quiet vigilance, and endurance was ending. The final weeks of winter left an indelible imprint, bodies conditioned to the cold, minds trained in vigilance, and households coordinated in patterns of survival that would inform life for generations. Spring was imminent. Yet even in the last dark hours, the lessons of winter lingered. Every ember, every rationed meal, every whispered prayer had mattered. Survival had been earned silently, without fanfare, and this quiet achievement became the foundation for the season to come. The night before spring. As the final grip of winter loosened, the nights began to change subtly. Darkness still fell early, and frost lingered, but hints of light and warmth began to pierce the monotony. Medieval peasants were alert to these shifts, noting them with quiet attention because survival had taught them that even small changes could signal hope or danger. The night before the first signs of spring was always peculiar. The air, though still biting, carried a faint softness. Wind seemed less insistent, carrying distant scents of thawing earth or river water. Animals stirred differently, less restless, as if sensing the change. Even children slept a little more deeply, less prone to wake from imagined threats. Adults, however, remained vigilant, aware that winter's final hours could still be cruel. Households followed the routines that had carried them through months. Fires were banked carefully, blankets arranged to preserve warmth, and embers checked repeatedly. Nothing was left to chance. Every action was deliberate, every gesture a preservation of life. Months of repetition had ingrained rhythm into every movement. Lighting the hearth, shifting blankets, feeding animals, each task was performed with calm precision, almost instinctual. Food, though scarcer than in earlier winter, was managed with meticulous care. Portions were rationed deliberately. Every crumb of bread, every sip of weak gruel, was weighed against the remaining nights. Adults often surrendered their share to children or the weakest members of the household, knowing that survival depended not on individual consumption but on collective endurance. The final nights emphasized the mental aspects of survival as much as the physical. Vigilance remained constant, even as hope began to seep in. Experience taught that the mind could falter after months of strain. Anxiety, fear, and fatigue were persistent companions. Yet rituals, prayers whispered quietly before sleep, embers adjusted in specific ways, and repetitive storytelling, offered psychological stability. Faith, superstition, and habit intertwined to create a framework that allowed peasants to endure. Children, for their part, experienced these nights with a mixture of weariness and unspoken anticipation. They were beginning to notice the signs of change in the environment. Birds returned with distant calls. The snow softened, revealing patches of frozen earth beneath. Even in sleep, they sensed the approaching shift, and parents encouraged subtle awareness without excitement. The night before spring was also marked by reflection. Adults, often quietly, considered the months just endured. They counted their losses and gains. The absence of some, whether livestock, neighbors, or even family members, was noted with restrained grief. The survival of the household, however, offered validation for all that had been sacrificed. This reflection was practical rather than sentimental, a mental inventory that prepared the mind for future seasons. Storms were rare but still possible during this threshold period. Peasants had learned the necessity of preparation even in moments of hope. Supplies were double-checked. Firewood was replenished if possible. Structures were inspected for weakness. Every precaution was taken quietly, without urgency, because calm observation had proven more effective than panic. Sleep remained shallow, but less restless. Awareness persisted, yet the mind could rest slightly more fully because the pattern of winter nights had been internalized. Body and mind had adapted to fragmented rest. Adults could now lie in bed with slightly less tension, knowing that experience, observation, and attention would compensate for exhaustion. Stories told at night continued to play a role. They were quieter now, less about endurance in immediate danger and more about the return of life, warmth, and light. Tales of spring, of animals returning, of fields readying for planting, were shared softly to maintain morale. They reminded all that months of suffering would yield to renewal. Even the simplest household activities carried symbolic weight. Adjusting the bedding, feeding animals, or tending the fire were not just practical, they were signs that life continued and that spring was imminent. These actions reinforced the continuity of existence, bridging the final hours of winter with the approaching season of growth. The night before spring also brought subtle shifts in interaction. Neighbors might offer assistance more freely, sharing small portions of food or firewood without explicit request. This cooperation, cultivated over months of shared hardship, reflected a collective understanding. Survival was most effective when supported by quiet mutual aid. By midnight, anticipation was barely perceptible but pervasive. Adults remained calm, maintaining vigilance while acknowledging the near end of struggle. Children's breathing deepened in response to slightly warmer air. Fires glowed steadily, reflecting the cumulative lessons of countless nights endured. The household was poised between hardship and relief, suspended in the careful balance that defined winter survival. Morning of the first spring day promised subtle transformation. Ice would begin to soften. Snow would recede slowly. Streams would murmur faintly beneath the remaining frost. The night before spring, though still cold and demanding, was lighter than any night of deep winter. It was a threshold, a bridge between months of survival and the hope of renewal. In these hours, peasants understood that endurance had shaped them. Their bodies were lean but strong, their minds alert yet disciplined, their households coordinated in a rhythm learned over countless nights. Winter had been harsh, relentless, and unforgiving, but the night before spring proved that persistence, vigilance, and cooperation could carry life forward even through the most challenging periods. When the first faint light of dawn finally approached, households could feel the subtle change in air, light, and sound. Though the frost remained and winds still cut sharply, a quiet sense of relief and anticipation settled over the village. Survival had been maintained, and hope could finally begin to take root in a world that had for so long been ruled by darkness, cold, and the slow passage of endless nights. The fragile edge of survival. By the time the final weeks of winter approached, medieval peasants were living on the fragile edge of survival. Months of persistent cold, restricted food, and nightly vigilance had accumulated into an almost tangible weight. Bodies were lean, sometimes gaunt, and every movement required deliberation. Every night was a negotiation between life and the relentless demands of winter darkness. Nights had become an intricate choreography. Firewood was tended constantly, placed carefully to maximize heat without wasting fuel. Embers were banked strategically, ash cleared at intervals, and logs shifted to maintain a steady burn. Flames could not be allowed to die, yet they could not be allowed to flare uncontrollably and consume valuable resources. Every task was small but critical, executed with a precision born of months of repetition. Children were bundled tightly, often pressed against parents or older siblings. Their small bodies lost heat rapidly, and even brief exposure could bring shivering or hypothermia. Parents stayed awake to monitor them, whispering softly when they stirred or cried in their sleep. In some households, children were trained to move minimally, shift slowly, and conserve heat, turning instinctive behavior into practiced survival. Food was a constant concern. Rations that had lasted through the worst of winter were now nearly exhausted. Peasants measured each crumb, each sip of thin gruel, knowing that miscalculation could tip the balance toward danger. Hunger was never ignored, but it was accepted as a reality of life. Adults often consumed less so that children could eat, reinforcing both familial bonds and practical survival strategy. The psychological toll of winter nights at this stage was immense. Fear, exhaustion, and uncertainty had layered together, creating a persistent mental pressure. Darkness magnified every creak, every gust of wind, every movement from the animals. The mind filled in the gaps, imagining worst-case scenarios. Yet experience provided a quiet counterbalance. Villagers had endured worse nights. They understood patterns of storm, frost, and cold, and these patterns guided cautious optimism. Storms could still arrive suddenly. Snow, wind, and ice tested the strength of buildings and the coordination of households. Livestock needed continual attention, as animals were more sensitive to cold than humans. Even minor mishaps, dropping a log, leaving a door slightly open, spilling water on a blanket, could have consequences amplified by the frozen night. Ritual and routine became more critical than ever. Every movement carried meaning. Prayers whispered before sleep, embers banked in a specific pattern, bedding adjusted in repeated gestures. These were not mere habits. They were survival strategies encoded into daily life. Saints, protective charms, and small tokens provided psychological reinforcement. Belief, whether religious or superstitious, offered a framework to understand and endure the relentless night. Sleep was shallow and interrupted. Adults woke repeatedly to check embers, stir the fire, adjust blankets, or attend to restless children. Nightmares of hunger, cold, or loss occurred more frequently, but they were managed calmly. Experience had taught peasants that panic wasted energy and could cost life. Vigilance was constant, but deliberate. The body adapted to light sleep, muscles remaining tense enough to respond quickly, minds alert yet functional. Even the smallest triumphs were celebrated quietly. A fire maintained through the night, a child sleeping without disturbance, or a meal rationed just right until morning was considered a victory. These achievements were not outwardly acknowledged with laughter or cheer, they were internalized, forming the measure of success in the harshest months. The final weeks of winter left lasting impressions on memory and behavior. Families learned subtle adjustments that would carry forward into the next year: thicker bedding, careful rationing, precise fire management, and constant attention to structural weaknesses in homes. These lessons were passed down from parent to child, often silently, through observation rather than instruction. Survival had become second nature, and knowledge of past nights became an invisible inheritance. Communal awareness remained critical. Even if neighbors were physically distant, households listened for distant sounds: the faint crack of a roof, the muffled voice of another peasant, or the howl of a wolf. Knowledge that others were enduring similar struggles reinforced mental resilience. Collective memory, lessons from prior winters, warnings from neighbors, and subtle communication across villages formed an invisible network that bolstered survival. The final nights tested endurance in every way. The body, mind, and spirit were stretched simultaneously. Every decision, how to tend the fire, how to layer clothing, how to manage rations, was weighted with consequence. The winter had revealed limits of human endurance, patience, and adaptability. Peasants had been forced to confront fragility and respond with careful attention, discipline, and cooperation. By the first faint signs of thaw, peasants were not triumphant in the sense of joy or celebration. Relief was quiet, measured, and practical. Survival had been maintained, but at a cost of energy, strength, and peace of mind. The final deep nights of winter were remembered not as dramatic tales, but as procedural victories, evidence of competence, vigilance, and endurance. In these last weeks, villagers had learned the true meaning of resilience. Life was fragile. Comfort was rare. Survival was constant, deliberate, and collective. The end of winter did not erase hardship, it transformed it into knowledge, rhythm, and habit. Families emerged prepared for the seasons to come, carrying forward experience that would quietly guide future generations. The fragile edge of survival marked both an end and a beginning. The cold, the darkness, and the nights of near exhaustion had tested every dimension of human life. Bodies were conditioned, minds sharpened, and relationships reinforced. Winter had been endured, but not passively, it had been managed with a careful balance of skill, faith, and routine. By the conclusion of Part 47, the last deep nights of winter had left their imprint. Life continued, quiet but tenacious, and peasants knew that endurance was a measure of existence itself. They had survived, and survival, in this context, was the ultimate achievement. The last deep cold. Even as winter's grip began to loosen in villages, a final deep cold lingered. This was the cold of endurance itself, a reminder that the season had not yet fully released its hold. Nights remained long, winds sharp, and frost stubborn. Peasants had grown accustomed to hardship, but the last weeks tested patience, body, and spirit in ways the preceding months had only prepared them for partially. The household settled into night with learned routines. Firewood was stacked close, blankets spread carefully, and animals checked and repositioned for warmth. Children slept as best they could, pressed close to parents. Adults moved quietly, conserving heat, energy, and attention. Each task was deliberate. Every movement mattered. A dropped log, a misplaced blanket, or a fire smothered by ash could change the balance of survival. The final cold demanded vigilance in ways that were both subtle and constant. Windows frosted over quickly, and cracks in walls allowed cold air to invade. Even the smallest gaps could pull heat from the body, making sleep shallow and restless. Families learned to breathe slowly, move deliberately, and regulate the fire so that it burned steadily without flaring dangerously. Bodies were stiff and sore from months of labor and sleep interrupted by chill. Muscles protested, joints ached, and fatigue accumulated like snow in layers over bone. Yet, the human body adapted. Layers of wool, blankets, and close body heat allowed peasants to maintain enough warmth to survive. Numbness was temporary. Frostbite was feared but mostly avoided through careful preparation and constant observation. Food was increasingly sparse during these final nights. What remained in storage was rationed with the precision of a ritual. Each crumb, each sip of gruel, was measured to extend life through the night. Adults often ate less than children to conserve resources for the young and those who worked outside in the day. Hunger was a constant companion, whispering from stomachs and shaping every dream, but it was endured without complaint. Storms, when they arrived, were sudden and merciless. Heavy snowfall could block access to neighboring households or prevent emergency trips for additional fuel. The wind pressed against walls, rattled doors, and whistled through eaves. Animals sensed danger instinctively and became restless, adding noise to already tense households. Yet peasants did not panic. They had survived worse. Calm observation, ritual, and experience were their shields. Fear persisted in these nights, though tempered by routine. The dark was not merely absence of light, it was a space where uncertainty multiplied. Creaks, groans from timber, the shifting weight of snow, all demanded attention. Vigilance became second nature. Sleep was light but functional. Adults woke repeatedly, checking embers, observing breathing, and ensuring that no household member succumbed to cold or illness. Psychologically, these nights were heavy. Months of endurance accumulated in the mind as well as the body. Repetition made routine comforting but monotonous. Each night felt like a test repeated with minimal variation. Stories and whispered prayers served to structure perception. Saints and protective charms were invoked quietly, giving reassurance that there was order even in the chaos of darkness, cold, and hunger. Children experienced these nights differently. Their resilience allowed them slightly deeper sleep, though nightmares were common. Hunger and fear manifested in restless movements, crying, or soft murmurs. Parents responded immediately, rocking, whispering, or adjusting blankets. These interactions were brief but repeated across the long hours, creating rhythms of care that were both practical and comforting. Physical endurance intertwined with mental endurance. Peasants had learned to control breathing, shift positions to preserve heat, and remain calm despite discomfort. Shivering was minimized through layers, proximity, and movement. Awareness of the fire, embers, and surroundings became almost instinctual, requiring attention but no conscious thought. Even the simplest acts were loaded with importance. Repositioning a child, stirring embers, or adding a small piece of wood was critical. The night was measured not in hours but in the continuous performance of these essential tasks. Failure was not dramatic, it was quiet, incremental, and potentially deadly. By morning, survival was celebrated only in quiet relief. Eyes open to pale light filtering through frost-coated windows. Bodies were stiff, faces pale from cold or hunger, but everyone remained alive. The fire still glowed. Animals were alive. The night had been endured, and another sunrise had arrived. These final weeks of deep cold left lasting impressions. They were remembered not as stories of heroism but as a series of procedural victories. Each night survived was proof of competence, planning, and vigilance. Families carried this knowledge forward, subtly altering routines, storing resources differently, and preparing more carefully for future winters. Peasants had learned that survival depended on attention to small details, cooperation among family members, and the quiet enforcement of ritual and routine. Endurance was not dramatic. It was invisible. Yet in its persistence, it became powerful. Even as winter slowly surrendered to spring, the last deep cold was not forgotten. Memory of frost, hunger, storms, and vigilance shaped behavior, perception, and communal knowledge. Lessons passed silently from parents to children ensured that the next generation would inherit not just survival skills, but the calm, methodical mindset necessary to endure the coldest nights. By the end of part 46, the household had survived another night. They were exhausted but alive. Every action, every decision, every whispered prayer had contributed to endurance. And as the horizon began to hint at longer days, they understood that the worst had passed, but only barely. Winter still lingered, and vigilance remained essential. The shared burden of survival. No household survived entirely alone. Even isolated families relied on indirect support, the distant village fire, the passing neighbor, or communal memory of best practices for extreme nights. Winter was a collective challenge, and knowledge of shared struggle comforted households. During night, peasants were acutely aware of others. The sound of snow scraping against walls or the distant howl of wolves reminded them that life continued beyond their home. Collective vigilance was invisible but present. Everyone endured, everyone observed, and in this quiet observation, survival was enhanced. Survival was shared, not heroic. Winter nights emphasized cooperation in subtle ways, storing firewood carefully, preparing bedding to accommodate the young or weak, and observing rituals that maintained calm. These actions, though often unnoticed, sustained the village ecosystem, the body as strategy. By late winter, physical endurance had become strategic. The body was treated as a tool to conserve warmth, energy, and life itself. Every movement was calculated. Positions in bed were chosen to maximize heat. Limbs were rotated to prevent frostbite. Meals were eaten slowly to ensure that energy lasted through the night. Sleeping clothed became habitual. Extra layers were worn even when they restricted movement. Body heat was preserved through shared sleeping arrangements, sometimes with several family members pressed together. Even minor injuries were treated with extreme caution. Frostbite, blisters, and strains could compromise survival. Careful attention to the body was part of the nightly routine. Through these measures, peasants survived not only the cold but the cumulative effects of exhaustion, hunger, and illness. The human body was fragile, yet adaptable when treated with patience and strategy, the threshold of spring. As the final weeks of winter ended, nights slowly began to shorten. Cold remained, but it became more tolerable. Bodies had adapted. Minds had grown accustomed to the rhythm of vigilance. Families noticed subtle changes, the return of bird calls, the thinning of frost on windows, the faint warmth of a sun that lingered longer each day. Spring was not celebrated with revelry. Its arrival was quiet, practical, and subdued. Survival was proven. Lessons learned during countless nights of hardship guided behavior in the new season. The endurance of winter nights left an invisible imprint. Peasants carried memory, skill, and habit forward. These experiences shaped their approach to life, preparing them for future winters, hardships, and challenges. Winter had tested, taught, and refined the household. Its nights had been long, silent, and exhausting. Yet each night survived strengthened the bonds between family members, reinforced trust in neighbors, and left a legacy of resilience that would persist for generations. The final cold stretch. As winter approached its last weeks, medieval peasants faced nights that felt endlessly long despite knowing spring was near. These were not merely cold nights, they were nights of cumulative exhaustion. Bodies, already weakened by months of minimal food and persistent cold, struggled to maintain warmth. Muscles ached from continuous work, joints stiffened, and skin chafed under layers of wool and linen. Yet life required them to rise each day, tend to animals, fetch water, and check stored food before the darkness returned to claim their attention once more. The final cold stretch was psychologically taxing as well. Knowing that the worst of winter was behind them did little to alleviate fear of storms, hunger, and sickness. The nights retained their threatening quality because experience had taught peasants that misfortune often struck near the end of hardship. Illnesses that had been manageable earlier in winter suddenly became dangerous as fatigue set in. Weak family members required extra care, consuming attention and energy that was already limited. Even the simplest tasks before nightfall became tests of endurance. Firewood had to be stacked meticulously to ensure nights could be survived. Wet clothing required extra drying near the hearth, and blankets needed constant adjustment to preserve heat through hours of unconscious shivering. Food, always rationed, demanded careful measurement. A loaf of bread could not be eaten greedily even if it seemed sufficient, every crumb was precious for the remaining nights. Children endured as well, though differently. They slept more deeply than adults but were prone to waking from nightmares shaped by hunger, cold, and darkness. Parents would rouse themselves to comfort them, rocking them gently, whispering words of reassurance that the night would end, that morning would come, that they were still safe. These moments were brief but repeated nightly, creating a rhythm that shaped family life. Storms continued to intrude unpredictably. Even light snow could disrupt carefully prepared plans. A sudden blizzard would block access to neighbors, complicating survival strategies that depended on communal support. Livestock, if housed near the family hearth, required attention throughout the night. Feeding them was not just practical, it was survival. Animals brought warmth, and their loss could be catastrophic. The psychological burden of these nights was as heavy as the physical. Sleep was shallow and fragmented. Nightmares were frequent. Even shared sleep with family members offered limited comfort, as everyone faced their personal fears. Adults often awoke repeatedly, checking the fire, listening for any unusual sounds outside, and ensuring that no household member had succumbed to cold or illness. Every creak of the roof, every gust of wind through gaps in doors or windows, demanded vigilance. During this final cold stretch, rituals became even more critical. Even the smallest actions, whispering a prayer before sleep, arranging embers carefully, placing food in specific locations, were magnified in importance. These repeated behaviors gave structure to the chaos, a sense of control in nights that otherwise seemed endless. Faith and superstition intertwined, guiding the peasant household toward quiet endurance. Saints were invoked to protect the sleeping, spirits were respected but feared, and stories were told near the fading fire to remind listeners that others had survived similar trials. The nights demanded patience as much as endurance. Time was no longer measured by hours but by sensations, the return of body warmth after shifting position, the dwindling growl of a starving stomach, the rise and fall of the fire in its hearth. Each moment passed slowly, but survival depended on attention to these details. Mistakes could be fatal, even minor ones. Forgetting to add a log to the fire, misjudging the thickness of a blanket, or failing to notice a child's shivering could have consequences that lasted until morning, or worse, until the next night. Peasants developed a rhythm unique to this period. Rest came in fragments, interspersed with wakefulness for necessary checks. Awareness became second nature. Muscles relaxed only partially, ready to respond to sudden danger, whether from collapsing roofs, runaway animals, or worsening storms. The mind occupied itself with preparation and observation rather than worry, conserving energy for what mattered most, survival. By the end of these nights, even the simplest victories were deeply appreciated. A fire that burned steadily, a loaf of bread that lasted until morning, children asleep through the worst hours, and livestock unharmed were considered triumphs. Each sunrise represented not only the end of darkness but proof that life continued despite the challenges. Hope existed, but it was quiet, restrained, and practical, a promise that survival through the night could be repeated tomorrow if all careful measures were observed. These final weeks of winter left a lasting mark on memory. Peasants recalled nights by their difficulty rather than by specific events. The sharpest gusts, the coldest hours, the moments of waking to tend to a fire, all became reference points for experience. This collective memory informed preparation for subsequent winters. Families adjusted bedding, stored extra firewood, and altered routines to improve endurance in the future. Knowledge passed from parent to child through example rather than explicit instruction. By surviving the final stretch, peasants learned subtle lessons about their limits. They understood how far their bodies could be pushed, how much they could endure psychologically, and how closely human life depended on observation, preparation, and shared responsibility. They discovered that survival was not about comfort, but about sustained vigilance and quiet resilience. Shared loss and quiet mourning. Death affected entire villages. When someone died at night, neighbors knew by morning. Grief was shared quietly. Mourning was brief. Winter demanded function. Bodies were buried quickly. Food was shared if possible. Work continued. Loss strengthened resolve. Villages adapted to reduced numbers. Roles shifted. Children worked earlier. Elders taught faster. Winter nights taught acceptance. Death was not shocking. It was part of survival, the village as shelter. By the heart of winter, villages functioned as single organisms. Fires burned across multiple homes. Animals were distributed carefully. Resources were shared strategically. No household survived alone. Even those that thought they did relied on others indirectly. Winter nights revealed this truth clearly. Individual strength mattered less than collective endurance. When spring came, villages emerged thinner, quieter, but alive. Their survival was not heroic. It was cooperative. In the next part, the story will move toward winter rituals, beliefs, and traditions shaped specifically by long nights, and how peasants gave meaning to endurance itself. Winter rituals in the long night. By the deepest part of winter, medieval peasants began to treat the night differently. Survival alone was not enough. Meaning was needed. Long nights demanded something more than endurance, something that explained why suffering continued year after year. This was where ritual entered daily life, quietly and without ceremony. Winter rituals were simple. There were no grand celebrations. Instead, they were small repeated actions performed at night, often without spoken explanation. A prayer said in the same order every evening. A piece of bread placed near the hearth before sleep. A candle lit briefly, then extinguished, not for light but for presence. These rituals created rhythm. When nights felt endless, repetition gave them shape. Knowing what came next reduced anxiety. The body relaxed when the mind felt prepared. Families often followed traditions passed through generations. No one remembered when they began. They were done because they had always been done. During winter, tradition felt like protection. The hearth became sacred during night. Not holy in a formal sense, but respected. Fires were addressed gently. Ashes were treated carefully. Children were taught never to step over embers. Ritual did not change the cold. It changed how peasants faced it, faith as night shelter. Religion shaped winter nights deeply. When darkness surrounded everything, belief filled the space left behind. Medieval peasants believed night belonged partially to unseen forces. Faith offered boundaries where none existed physically. Before sleep, prayers were whispered. Not spoken loudly. Loud prayer felt dangerous. Quiet words felt safer, more sincere. These prayers asked for protection through the night, not comfort. Survival was enough. Saints associated with protection, warmth, and healing were invoked often in winter. Images carved into wood or painted crudely on walls watched over sleeping families. Whether they truly protected mattered less than belief that they did. Faith gave peasants permission to rest. Believing that something watched over them allowed sleep to come, even lightly. Religion also explained loss. Death at night was seen as part of a divine order. This belief softened grief enough to allow continuation. Faith did not remove fear. It organized it, stories told before sleep. Storytelling changed during winter nights. Stories became slower, quieter, and darker. They were told near the hearth as night approached, not to excite but to calm. These stories often focused on endurance. Travelers surviving storms. Saints walking through darkness. Villagers overcoming long winters. Children listened closely. Stories taught lessons without instruction. Stay close. Respect night. Do not wander. Endure. Adults listened too. Stories reminded them that others before them had survived. That winter had always ended eventually. As the fire dimmed, stories faded into silence. Words gave way to listening. The night reclaimed the house. Stories were not entertainment. They were preparation, marking time without light. Winter nights confused time. Without long daylight, peasants lost clear sense of hours. Time was measured differently. Cold increasing meant hours passing. Fire fading meant night deepening. Fatigue meant morning was closer. Some families used church bells as distant markers. Others relied on bodily rhythms. Hunger returned in predictable waves. Sleep broke and returned in patterns learned unconsciously. Marking time mattered. Knowing night was moving prevented despair. Winter nights were not endured blindly. They were counted quietly, felt internally, survived piece by piece, meaning in survival. By late winter, peasants found meaning not in comfort, but in persistence. Survival itself became identity. To endure night after night meant something. It proved strength, patience, and belonging. Those who survived winter were respected. Quietly. Without praise. Winter nights shaped character. They taught restraint, cooperation, humility. These lessons lasted beyond the season. When spring finally arrived, peasants did not celebrate winter's end loudly. They simply lived differently. Nights became easier. Fear loosened its grip. But winter was never forgotten. Its nights shaped everything that followed. In the next part, the story will move toward late winter exhaustion and the final stretch before spring, when hope returned slowly and survival reached its most fragile point. Animals and shared survival. Animals were part of winter nights too. Livestock meant food, warmth, and future security. Keeping them alive mattered as much as keeping people alive. Some animals were kept indoors or nearby. Their body heat helped warm spaces. Their sounds reassured households that valuable life still breathed nearby. Feeding animals during winter was difficult. Stored fodder was rationed carefully. If animals weakened, families weakened. At night, peasants listened for animal distress. A sick animal could mean starvation later. Winter nights demanded attention beyond human comfort, waiting for spring. As winter deepened, nights seemed endless. Peasants measured time not in days, but in survival. Each night endured brought them closer to spring, though it often felt impossibly distant. Stories were told quietly. Memories of warm seasons were shared. These moments offered mental warmth when physical warmth failed. Peasants did not hope for comfort. They hoped for continuation. Another sunrise. Another fire. Another shared night survived. Spring was not imagined as joy, but relief. Until then, winter nights ruled life completely. In the next part, we will explore isolation, silence, and the psychological toll of endless cold nights, when survival depended not only on the body, but on the mind, isolation and the weight of silence. As winter deepened, medieval peasants began to feel something heavier than cold or hunger. It was isolation. Long nights and short days slowly narrowed their world. Snow and ice cut villages off from one another. Roads disappeared beneath white silence. Travel became rare and dangerous, especially after sunset. During winter nights, silence pressed against the walls of peasant homes. Not the peaceful silence of rest, but a thick, watchful quiet. Sounds were fewer now. Insects were gone. Birds had migrated. Even distant human activity faded. What remained was wind, fire, and breathing. This silence affected the mind. With fewer distractions, thoughts grew louder. Worries about food, illness, and survival returned again and again. Night offered too much time to think and too little energy to escape those thoughts. People spoke less at night. Words felt unnecessary. Conversations required warmth and effort. Instead, families sat quietly before sleeping, listening to the fire and the wind outside. Silence became normal, even expected. Loneliness existed even among others. Shared beds did not always mean shared comfort. Everyone carried private fears. Would food last? Would sickness come? Would spring arrive in time? These questions had no answers. Winter nights shrank life to the interior of the mind. Peasants learned to endure silence as another season to survive, fear without shape. Fear during medieval winter nights was rarely specific. It had no clear enemy. It was not always wolves or thieves or spirits. It was uncertainty. Fear of what might happen while everyone slept. Darkness removed clarity. Without light, familiar spaces felt strange. The mind filled gaps with imagined threats. A creak became a presence. A gust of wind became a warning. Peasants did not panic easily. Fear was constant, not sudden. It lived quietly alongside routine. People checked doors, fires, animals, and children before sleep. Once these rituals were complete, fear was contained, but never gone. Stories helped give fear a shape. Tales of spirits, demons, and wandering souls explained what could not be controlled. These stories were not told to frighten, but to prepare. Fear with a name felt manageable. Religion also shaped fear. Night was believed to belong to forces beyond human sight. Prayers acted as protection. Faith did not remove fear, but it softened it, giving the mind something to hold on to in the dark. Fear became familiar. It stopped being questioned. It was simply part of winter nights, as expected as cold breath and stiff fingers, sleep that never fully came. True rest was rare in winter. Sleep arrived in fragments. Short periods of unconsciousness followed by wakefulness. This pattern was not considered a problem. It was normal. Peasants woke often. To shift position. To check the fire. To listen. Bodies did not relax fully in cold conditions. Muscles remained tense. The mind stayed alert. Dreams were vivid. Hunger and cold shaped them. Dreams of food, warmth, summer fields. Waking from such dreams made reality feel harsher. Children slept more deeply, but even they stirred often. Adults learned to rest without sleeping fully. This light sleep allowed quick response to danger. Night felt long because sleep was shallow. Time passed slowly. There were no clocks, only sensations. Cold returning meant time had passed. Fire fading meant more time had passed. Morning was not refreshing. It was an end to vigilance. Sleep had not restored energy, but it had preserved life. That was enough mental endurance. Winter nights tested the mind as much as the body. Endurance was mental before it was physical. Complaining changed nothing. Fear wasted energy. Acceptance preserved strength. Peasants developed emotional restraint. Expressions of despair were rare. Not because despair was absent, but because showing it weakened others. Silence protected morale. Routine helped. Repeating the same actions each night created control. Banking the fire. Securing the door. Arranging bedding. These rituals gave structure to uncertainty. Memory also helped. Peasants remembered past winters survived. They trusted experience more than hope. If they had endured before, they could endure again. Storytelling during evenings offered brief escape. Tales of heroes, saints, or humorous events reminded listeners that life extended beyond winter. These stories faded into sleep as night deepened. Mental survival meant narrowing focus. Not thinking of spring too soon. Not imagining starvation. Only thinking of the next morning. One night at a time, the quiet strength of endurance. By midwinter, endurance itself became a skill. Peasants did not fight winter nights. They adapted to them. Cold was expected. Hunger was expected. Fear was expected. Expectation removed shock. Shock wasted strength. Families moved together smoothly in the dark. Everyone knew their place. Their role. Their responsibility. This coordination came from years of repetition. Winter nights forged resilience. Children learned it early. Adults refined it. Elders embodied it. Survival was collective, not individual. When dawn arrived, it was met with quiet gratitude. Not celebration. Relief. Another night had passed. Another step closer to spring. These nights did not create legends. They created survivors. People who endured without recognition. People whose strength was invisible, but absolute. In the next part, the story will shift toward winter storms, extreme cold, and nights when survival was pushed to its absolute limit, where even endurance was tested beyond reason. Illness in the cold hours. Winter nights were the most dangerous time for sickness. During the day, movement and work kept bodies warm. At night, stillness allowed illness to take hold. Medieval peasants feared the dark hours because that was when coughs worsened, fevers rose, and weakness became impossible to hide. Cold air irritated lungs already damaged by smoke from hearth fires. Many peasants suffered from chronic coughing. At night, these coughs echoed loudly in small homes, waking others and reminding everyone how fragile life was. There was no medicine to ease breathing. Warmth and rest were the only remedies available. Fever was especially frightening. A person could go to bed shivering and wake burning with heat. Families watched closely, feeling foreheads with rough hands. Blankets were added or removed carefully. Too much warmth could worsen fever. Too little could invite death. Knowledge came from experience, not science. Children were vulnerable. Their small bodies lost heat quickly. Parents kept them close, listening to breathing in the dark. Many nights were spent half awake, counting breaths, hoping morning would come before illness deepened. Old age made winter nights even harsher. Joints stiffened painfully. Bones ached. Elders slept lightly, waking often. Cold seemed to settle permanently in their bodies. Winter was known as the season that carried the old away quietly. Illness was accepted as part of life. Fear existed, but panic was rare. Peasants understood limits. They could comfort, warm, and pray. Beyond that, they endured death in the night. Death often arrived quietly during winter nights. There were no sudden alarms, no dramatic moments. A person went to sleep and did not wake. This was common enough that it was feared, yet expected. When death occurred, the household responded with calm routines shaped by generations. Someone noticed stillness. Breathing had stopped. The body was cold. Candles were lit despite the risk. Darkness no longer mattered. The body was kept indoors overnight. Winter ground was too hard to dig. Burial waited for daylight or warmer conditions. Family members sat nearby, keeping watch. Silence filled the room, broken only by the fire and wind outside. Children learned early that death was part of winter. Fear was present, but so was understanding. Life was fragile. Survival was temporary. Death strengthened community bonds. Neighbors helped with burial preparations. Food was shared, even when scarce. Mourning happened quickly. Survival demanded it, prayers and superstition. Winter nights encouraged belief in unseen forces. When explanations failed, peasants turned to faith and superstition. Darkness made the world feel closer to something beyond human control. Prayers were whispered before sleep. Simple words learned in childhood. Protection was requested for the household, animals, and stored food. Saints were called upon to guard the night. Charms hung near doors. Symbols were carved into beams. These offered psychological comfort, if nothing else. Belief eased fear. Stories of spirits circulated in winter. Wandering souls. Creatures of cold and darkness. These stories warned children to stay indoors and reinforced respect for the night. Faith did not remove fear, but it gave it shape. Winter became something that could be endured with divine help, the longest nights. Winter nights felt endless. Without clocks, time was measured by cold, hunger, and fatigue. Darkness stretched for hours, broken only by brief waking moments. Peasants developed segmented sleep. Rest came in parts. Wakefulness followed. Then sleep returned. This rhythm felt natural. Outside, the moon moved slowly. Inside, bodies waited. Every night survived was a small victory. Morning was greeted with relief, not joy. The night was over. The day could be faced, endurance without choice. Medieval peasants did not choose resilience. It was forced upon them. Winter nights stripped life down to essentials. Warmth. Food. Breath. Comfort was rare. Complaints were pointless. Survival depended on acceptance and routine. Families endured together. Communities endured together. Night after night, they waited for spring. The cold taught patience. Hunger taught restraint. Darkness taught humility. When spring finally came, memories of winter nights faded quickly. They had to. Remembering too deeply made survival harder next time. Winter would return. And peasants would endure again, morning after survival. When morning finally arrived after a long winter night, it did not bring warmth or comfort. It brought proof of survival. Peasants woke stiff, sore, and tired, but alive. That alone mattered. The body felt heavy, joints reluctant to move, fingers numb even inside the house. Rising from bed required effort, as though the cold had settled into the bones overnight. The fire was checked first. If embers still glowed, relief followed. A dead hearth meant starting again, scraping sparks from flint with cold hands. Morning fires were small at first, coaxed carefully into life. Smoke filled the room, eyes watered, but warmth slowly returned. Children were woken gently. Night had taken much from them. Hunger showed on their faces. Mothers wrapped them tightly before sending them near the fire. Breakfast was simple, often nothing more than bread and weak ale or thin porridge. It was enough to begin another day. Outside, frost covered everything. Fields lay silent. Work continued regardless. Winter did not pause labor. It only made it harder. But surviving the night meant work could continue, and that meant food might last until spring, winter work and night preparation. Winter days were shorter, but they were busy. Peasants prepared constantly for the coming night. Firewood was gathered whenever possible. Clothing was checked and repaired. Straw bedding was shaken and adjusted. Every action during daylight had one purpose: make the night survivable. Men worked fields when possible, repaired tools, or cut wood. Women managed food stores, cooked carefully, and tended to children and elders. Everyone understood the rhythm. Day was for preparation. Night was for endurance. Clothing was dried near the hearth during the day. Wet wool at night was dangerous. Shoes were warmed and reshaped. Blankets were aired briefly to remove moisture. Nothing was wasted. As evening approached, food portions were measured again. No one ate freely. Hunger at night was accepted if it meant survival later. When darkness returned, routines repeated. Fires banked. Doors secured. Bodies gathered close. Winter demanded discipline, children of the cold. Children experienced winter nights differently. They understood less, but felt more. Cold frightened them deeply. Darkness filled their minds with imagined threats. Yet they adapted quickly, learning endurance early. Parents taught children to stay still at night, to conserve warmth. Crying was discouraged, not from cruelty, but necessity. Noise meant panic. Panic wasted energy. Children slept closer to warmth. They were wrapped tightly. Their survival mattered most. Many adults accepted hunger and cold willingly if it meant children endured. Winter shaped childhood harshly. Play disappeared. Nights taught patience and silence. Those who survived grew resilient quickly. Hunger beneath the blankets. Winter nights were not only cold. They were hungry. For medieval peasants, the ache of an empty stomach was as familiar as the ache in frozen fingers. Food shortages were a normal part of life, but winter sharpened hunger into something constant and exhausting. Most food was prepared and eaten during daylight hours. At night, there was rarely anything left to eat. Bread was rationed carefully. Porridge, when available, was thin and stretched to feed many mouths. Meat was a luxury saved for special occasions or long gone by midwinter. Once darkness fell, hunger had to be endured until morning. Lying in bed made hunger louder. The body, no longer distracted by work, focused on what it lacked. Stomachs growled softly in the quiet room. Children shifted uncomfortably. Adults ignored the feeling, having learned long ago that complaining changed nothing. Hunger was part of winter, just like cold and darkness. Peasants understood that eating too much too early could be dangerous. Food had to last until spring. Every loaf of bread, every sack of grain, every dried bean was counted. Women often went to bed hungrier than men, giving larger portions to children and workers who labored outside during the day. This quiet sacrifice was rarely spoken about. Sleep was shallow when hunger was strong. Some peasants dreamed of food, warm meals, and full tables. Others woke briefly, drinking cold water to dull the ache before turning over and forcing themselves back to rest. Hunger became something the body learned to live with, a background sensation that never fully disappeared. Winter hunger also weakened bodies. Illness spread more easily when people were underfed. A simple cough could become deadly. Yet peasants endured, trusting that if they survived the night, the next day might bring something edible, however small. Hunger did not end at dawn, but night made it feel heavier. Wrapped in blankets, listening to wind and distant sounds, peasants learned patience. Hunger was not a crisis unless it reached starvation. Until then, it was simply another burden carried through the dark, fire as life and threat. Fire was the center of winter survival, especially at night. Without it, medieval homes became unbearable. With it, danger was always present. Fire gave warmth, light, and comfort, but it also demanded respect and constant attention. Hearths were open and simple. Smoke escaped through roof openings or small vents, filling homes with thick air. At night, fires were reduced to embers. Flames were dangerous while people slept. One spark could set straw bedding or wooden walls alight. Entire villages had burned this way. Peasants banked their fires carefully before bed. Ash was spread over glowing coals to preserve heat while limiting flames. This technique required skill passed down through generations. Too much ash and the fire would die. Too little and it could flare dangerously. Throughout the night, someone often woke to check the hearth. Usually an adult, sometimes an older child. This was not seen as a burden but a responsibility. Fire kept the house alive. Losing it meant waking to a frozen home with no easy way to relight warmth. The glow of embers cast faint light across walls. Shadows moved slowly as the fire breathed. This soft glow was comforting, even hypnotic. Many peasants fell asleep watching it fade, trusting it to last until morning. Fire also dried clothing hung nearby. Wet wool was dangerous in winter. Damp garments stole heat from the body. By placing clothes near the hearth overnight, peasants prepared themselves for the next cold day. Yet fire always demanded fear. Children were warned never to play near it. Nighttime accidents were common. A slipped blanket, a fallen piece of straw, a careless movement. Fear of fire lived beside reliance on it. Winter nights revolved around this balance. Fire was life. Fire was risk. Peasants slept with one ear tuned to the hearth, listening for changes in sound that might signal danger, clothing worn through sleep. Unlike modern sleepwear, medieval peasants slept in the same clothes they worked in. Undressing fully was rare in winter. Removing layers meant surrendering warmth, and warmth was too precious to lose. Wool was the most common fabric. It was heavy, coarse, and itchy, but it retained heat even when damp. Linen shirts were worn beneath wool tunics, though many owned only one or two garments. Clothing was rarely washed in winter due to cold and limited water. Smells and stiffness were accepted realities. At night, peasants added extra layers if they had them. Cloaks doubled as blankets. Socks, if owned, were worn to bed. Hats were sometimes kept on, especially by children and elders. Every layer mattered. Clothing also protected against pests. Fleas and lice were common. Straw bedding attracted insects. Thick clothing created a barrier, imperfect but necessary. Scratching in the dark was common. It was another discomfort endured without complaint. Shoes were removed before bed but kept nearby. Leather stiffened in cold. Placing shoes near the hearth prevented them from freezing solid. Frozen shoes could crack and become unusable. Sleeping clothed restricted movement. Turning over required effort. But this limitation also reduced heat loss. Bodies learned to remain still, conserving warmth. In these layers, peasants drifted in and out of sleep, their clothing serving as armor against winter. Comfort was secondary. Survival came first, shared sleep and human warmth. Perhaps the most important source of warmth on winter nights was other people. Medieval peasants rarely slept alone. Beds were shared by couples, children, and sometimes extended family members. Space was limited, and warmth multiplied when bodies pressed together. Straw mattresses were placed close to the hearth when possible. Everyone arranged themselves carefully, older family members in the warmest spots, children tucked between adults. This was practical, not sentimental. Heat flowed where it was needed most. Shared sleep reduced fear. Breathing, movement, and quiet murmurs reassured everyone that they were not alone. In darkness, this mattered deeply. A child waking from a nightmare could reach out and touch a parent without speaking. Privacy was unknown. Bodies were accepted as they were. Survival stripped away modesty. What mattered was enduring the night together. Even illness did not separate families. Sick members were kept close, monitored through the night. Fevered bodies were cooled or warmed as needed. Night was a time of care as much as rest. When dawn approached, people began to stir. One by one, they rose, stiff and cold, but alive. Another night had passed. Medieval peasants did not romanticize winter nights. They accepted them. Through hunger, cold, fear, and exhaustion, they relied on each other. Shared sleep was not comfort. It was strategy. In the next part, the story will move deeper into illness, death, and how winter nights became the most dangerous time for the weak and the old. The sounds beyond the door, fear in medieval winter nights. When the fire dimmed and the household finally settled into uneasy sleep, medieval peasants were never truly alone. Even inside their fragile homes, the night made its presence known through sound. Winter nights were not silent. They were filled with distant noises that carried easily through frozen air, turning imagination into fear. Outside the wooden door, the world felt vast and hostile. Snow muffled footsteps but sharpened other sounds. The wind moved through bare trees with a low, hollow voice, creaking branches that rubbed together like bones. Roof thatch shifted slightly under frost, releasing dry crackling noises that echoed inside the home. Each unfamiliar sound caused sleepers to stir, hearts beating faster in the darkness. Animals were the most common nighttime presence. Wolves prowled closer to villages in winter, driven by hunger. Their howls carried far across frozen fields, long and mournful, reminding peasants that the wilderness had not disappeared just because the land was settled. Even when wolves did not attack, their voices alone were enough to keep sleep shallow and restless. Foxes barked sharply, sudden and alarming. Owls called from nearby trees, their cries interpreted as omens by many. Superstition thrived in winter darkness. Sounds that could not be easily explained were often blamed on spirits, demons, or wandering souls unable to find rest. In a world without artificial light, darkness magnified fear. Livestock inside or near the house added their own sounds. A cow shifting weight. A goat stamping hooves. Chickens fluttering in sleep. These noises were familiar, yet they could still startle half-asleep peasants, especially when mixed with outside sounds. Listening became instinctive. Everyone learned to recognize what belonged and what did not. Doors were thick but imperfect. Gaps allowed cold air inside and sound both ways. A strong gust of wind could rattle the door violently, making it seem as though someone or something was trying to enter. Peasants often secured doors with heavy wooden beams or ropes, not just to keep animals out, but to create a sense of safety. Windows, when they existed, were even weaker. Cloth coverings fluttered. Wooden shutters knocked against frames. Frost formed along edges, making the openings creak and pop as temperatures dropped. Every noise became part of the night's rhythm, learned over years but never fully comforting. Children were especially sensitive to these sounds. They pressed closer to parents, seeking reassurance without words. Elders murmured prayers under their breath, habits formed over decades of winter survival. Religion offered comfort when understanding failed. Crosses, charms, and whispered blessings were believed to protect against unseen threats lurking beyond the door. Darkness itself was feared. Without candles or oil lamps, most homes surrendered completely to night. Light was conserved. Flames were extinguished early to reduce fire risk and save fuel. This meant hours of total darkness, broken only by the faint glow of embers. Shapes shifted in the mind. Familiar objects became threatening silhouettes. Sleep came unevenly. Some peasants developed the habit of waking regularly throughout the night. This was not insomnia as we know it today, but a survival rhythm. Short periods of rest followed by alertness. Checking the fire. Listening for danger. Adjusting blankets. Then drifting off again. Outside, winter nights stretched long. The moon reflected off snow, casting pale light across empty fields. Travelers avoided night journeys. Roads were dangerous. Getting lost in winter darkness often meant death. This knowledge lingered in every peasant's mind, reinforcing the instinct to stay indoors and endure whatever cold awaited inside. Morning was the true relief. Even weak daylight brought reassurance. Sounds became clearer. Shapes returned to normal. The world felt manageable again. But night always returned. And with it came the same sounds, the same fears, the same endurance. Medieval peasants did not conquer winter nights. They survived them through familiarity, routine, and shared vigilance. Listening became a skill. Fear became controlled. Sleep became an act of quiet resistance against a season that showed no mercy. In the next part, we will explore food, hunger, and how winter nights were endured on empty stomachs, when survival depended as much on rationing as on warmth. Sleeping fully dressed, clothing as survival. For medieval peasants, sleepwear did not exist. Night offered no relief from cold, so clothing remained on the body from dusk until dawn. Removing garments meant surrendering warmth, something few could afford to do. Even indoors, winter nights were nearly as cold as the open air. Clothing was made primarily of wool, linen, and occasionally animal hides. Wool was prized for its ability to retain warmth even when damp, but it was coarse and heavy. Garments stiffened with repeated use, absorbing smoke from the hearth and moisture from sweat and snow. These clothes were rarely washed during winter, as water froze quickly and drying was nearly impossible. Layers were essential. A peasant might wear a linen undergarment, a wool tunic, and an outer cloak. At night, cloaks doubled as blankets. Hoods were pulled tight around faces. Hands were tucked beneath bodies or pressed against chests to preserve heat. Feet, often the first to go numb, were wrapped in cloth or stuffed with straw. Shoes were worn to bed by some, especially children and elders. Leather hardened in cold, offering little insulation, but it was better than bare skin. Socks were rare. Foot coverings were improvised from rags or wool scraps. Clothing was precious. A family might own only one set per person. If garments became wet during the day, drying them before night was critical. Damp clothing could mean sickness or death during sleep. Many peasants stood close to the hearth in the evening, turning slowly to dry every layer, even as smoke burned their eyes. At night, clothing restricted movement. Turning in bed required effort. Blankets tangled with sleeves and cloaks. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the need to shift position to keep blood flowing. Waking with numb limbs was common. Yet clothing provided psychological comfort. Being wrapped tightly offered a sense of protection. The weight of wool pressed against the body, reminding peasants they were still alive, still warm enough to endure another night. In the next part, we will look at beds, straw mattresses, and shared sleeping, and how medieval peasants used closeness itself as a weapon against the cold, straw beds and shared warmth. Beds in medieval peasant homes were simple, heavy, and shared. Privacy was a luxury unknown to most. A bed was not a personal space but a communal one, shaped by necessity rather than comfort. The mattress was a sack filled with straw, hay, or dried leaves. Over time, the stuffing flattened and shifted, creating uneven surfaces that pressed into hips and shoulders. Straw attracted insects and absorbed moisture, yet it was replaced only when absolutely necessary. In winter, replacing bedding was avoided, as fresh straw offered no warmth at first. Families slept together to conserve heat. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents all occupied the same bed. Body heat accumulated slowly, creating a fragile pocket of warmth beneath heavy wool blankets and cloaks. The smallest children were placed in the center, where warmth lasted longest. Movement was limited. Turning disturbed others. Yet stillness came at a cost. Remaining in one position too long allowed cold to creep back in. Sleep became a cycle of brief rest and quiet adjustment. For many, animals shared the sleeping space indirectly. Chickens roost nearby. A goat or calf might be housed just beyond a thin wall. Their warmth mattered. Their presence mattered more. It meant survival resources were still alive. Nighttime illness was feared. Cold aggravated joint pain, coughs, and fevers. A sick family member was kept close, surrounded by bodies and blankets. Warmth was medicine when nothing else was available. Despite hardship, shared sleeping reinforced bonds. Winter nights were endured together. Fear, cold, and exhaustion were shared burdens. This closeness created resilience, a silent agreement to survive as one unit. Next, we will explore fire, fuel, and fear, and why managing the hearth at night was one of the most dangerous decisions a peasant could make: fire and darkness, balancing warmth and death. Fire was both savior and threat. Without it, winter nights were unbearable. With it, danger was constant. Medieval peasants lived with this contradiction every night of the cold season. Wood was scarce. Gathering it in winter was difficult and dangerous. Forest paths were icy. Hands numbed quickly. Each piece of firewood was used carefully. Fires were kept small, controlled, and never wasted. At night, flames were reduced to embers. A fully burning fire could ignite thatch roofs or straw bedding. Entire villages had burned because of a single spark. Peasants feared fire almost as much as cold. Before sleep, embers were banked with ash to preserve heat. Someone usually woke during the night to check the hearth. This was often the responsibility of adults who slept lightly. Children were never trusted with fire at night. Smoke lingered in homes, stinging eyes and lungs. Chronic coughing was common. Yet smoke also deterred insects and animals. It was another trade-off peasants accepted without question. When the fire died completely, the cold returned fast. Breath became visible. Frost formed on walls. Sleep grew shallow. The body fought to retain heat, burning precious energy. Hunger followed. Despite danger, fire represented hope. As long as embers glowed, morning was possible. The hearth was watched, respected, and feared. It was the last defense against a night that could kill silently. In the next part, we will step outside and listen to the sounds of medieval winter nights, and why darkness itself was one of the greatest enemies peasants faced. Inside the peasant home, walls that could not hold warmth. A medieval peasant's home was never meant to defeat winter. It was only meant to delay it. These houses were built quickly, cheaply, and with whatever materials were close at hand. Wood from nearby forests, mud mixed with straw, rough stone pulled from fields. There was no insulation in the modern sense, no sealed windows, no layered barriers against cold. The walls breathed, and in winter, they breathed cold air endlessly. Most peasant homes followed the same basic design. One main room served every purpose. Cooking, eating, sleeping, working, and sometimes keeping animals all happened within the same enclosed space. The roof was usually thatched with straw or reeds. In heavy snowfall, moisture seeped through slowly, dripping into the room below. When temperatures dropped at night, that moisture froze, turning parts of the interior into damp, icy patches. Windows were small or non-existent. Glass was rare and expensive. Many homes relied on simple wooden shutters or cloth coverings. During winter nights, these openings were closed tightly, but even then, wind slipped through gaps in the frame. The cold did not rush in violently. It crept, slow and patient, filling every corner. The floor was bare earth. Sometimes it was packed hard, sometimes it was covered with straw that was changed infrequently. In winter, the ground beneath the house became frozen, and the cold rose upward, pressing into feet, legs, and backs. Sitting or lying directly on the floor was painful. Beds were raised slightly, but not enough to escape the cold completely. The hearth was the most important feature of the house. It was usually an open fire pit or simple stone hearth set against a wall or in the center of the room. Smoke escaped through a hole in the roof or through cracks in the thatch. This meant warmth escaped too. Keeping the fire burning all night was dangerous and wasteful, yet letting it die completely invited unbearable cold. Most families chose a fragile balance, letting the fire fade into embers while hoping it would last until morning. At night, the house settled into quiet sounds. The creak of wood contracting in the cold. The soft crackle of dying embers. The occasional drip of melting frost. These sounds were familiar, yet never comforting. They reminded peasants that their homes were fragile shells against a powerful season. Furniture was minimal. A rough table, benches, perhaps a chest for storing grain or clothing. Everything was positioned close to the hearth during winter. The farther one moved from the fire, the colder the air became. Children were placed closest. Elders followed. Strong adults took the edges, absorbing the worst of the cold. Despite the discomfort, these homes offered something vital. Shelter from wind. A shared space. Familiar walls. In a world where stepping outside at night could mean death, even a poorly insulated home was a refuge. Peasants accepted its limitations because there was no alternative. In the next part, we will explore how medieval peasants dressed for sleep, and why clothing was often their most important defense against the freezing nights. The silence of medieval winter nights. When winter arrived in the medieval world, it did not announce itself gently. It crept in slowly, draining warmth from the land, shortening the days, and stretching the nights into long, silent hours that tested the endurance of every peasant family. There were no forecasts, no warnings beyond the behavior of animals and the color of the sky. When the cold came, it stayed, sometimes for months, reshaping daily life into a quiet struggle for survival. For medieval peasants, night was the most dangerous part of winter. Daylight offered movement, work, and some measure of control. Night brought stillness, fear, and cold that seeped through walls, clothing, and skin. Homes were simple structures made of wood, mud, straw, and stone. They were not built to keep warmth in, only to offer basic shelter from wind and snow. Gaps in walls, thin doors, and open hearths allowed cold air to flow freely inside. As darkness fell, families gathered closer together. The fire in the hearth became the heart of the home, not just for cooking but for survival. Wood was precious, and fires were kept small to conserve fuel. When flames died down, embers were carefully covered with ash to preserve heat through the night. Even then, warmth faded quickly, and the cold returned like an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. Beds were not private spaces. Entire families often slept in the same room, sometimes in the same bed. Straw mattresses provided minimal insulation from the frozen ground beneath. Blankets were heavy, rough, and rarely sufficient. Many peasants slept fully clothed, wearing wool garments stiff from repeated use and damp from daily labor. The cold was constant, pressing against their bodies, reminding them that survival was never guaranteed. Animals played a quiet but vital role in these nights. Cows, goats, and chickens were often kept inside or in attached shelters. Their body heat helped raise the temperature slightly, and their presence offered reassurance. The sounds of breathing, shifting hooves, and soft movement filled the darkness, breaking the silence that could otherwise feel overwhelming. Outside, the world was still. Snow absorbed sound, and wind whispered through bare trees. Wolves and other predators roamed the countryside, drawn closer to villages by hunger. Peasants feared not only the cold but what might come with it. Doors were barred, prayers were whispered, and charms were placed near beds to ward off unseen dangers believed to lurk in winter darkness. Sleep was not deep or restful. It came in fragments, interrupted by cold, hunger, and discomfort. People woke often to adjust blankets, add wood to the fire if any remained, or check on children and elders. The body never fully relaxed. Winter nights demanded vigilance, even in exhaustion. Yet, despite the hardship, these nights were endured. Generations before had survived them, and peasants trusted in routine, faith, and shared endurance. Morning light, though weak and pale, always returned. And with it came the quiet hope that another night had been survived. In the next part, we will step inside a medieval peasant home and explore how these houses were built to face the cold, and why they offered both shelter and danger during long winter nights.